All righty, there we go. Good afternoon. Happy Friday to everyone. Welcome to Walking Through History. My name is Nick Angel, and on the screen beside me, hopefully it's being seen. I'm trying something new, just as far as whenever we're just talking and not sharing a screen this afternoon. But hopefully beside me is Alan Seenestrang, my good friend. There we go. Yep, looks good on Facebook. Has joined me today, as always, as we are wrapping up our portion of this study in Genesis. My wife asked me, just to clarify, she said, are you done with this study now that you finished Genesis? I was like, well, we're finishing the Genesis portion of the history that we find within the Bible, but we know there is so much more. We're going to keep rolling right next week into Exodus and continue looking through the text. Alan and I have talked some about how we're going to do this, and we're going to stick as best we can, I believe, to the narrative portions of Scripture. So that means that some books that aren't necessarily narratives, we're not going to give much attention to. So we're going to try to stick to the narrative, stick to the story, and just trace it throughout Scripture. And however long that takes, we've been batting around making a YouTube channel and putting these videos on the YouTube channel for better preservation for later on, in case people want to use them in the future, or we want to go back and use them again in the future. But all that is all these are just efforts in order to get into the Bible and to focus on the story, to learn from it. And as I've said time and time again, I'm convinced that the more we know the Bible, the more we know of the Bible, the more we can understand it, the greater our trust and belief in God can be, and the stronger disciples and Christians we can be. Thank you for those who have been with us all along the way. We appreciate you giving us a couple hours of your week every week, and we hope that you felt blessed by our studies. I know, speaking personally, I have benefited greatly from really getting into the text and looking at it in a different way than I have in the past, and I hope that you can say the same. And we are very appreciative, especially to Alan, for all of his good work. Brother, it's good to see you this afternoon, and I hope that you have felt blessed by this study as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Uh, this type of study is kind of one of my favorites. I love walking through and examining the history, and I've done it several times in my lifetime. But even every time something new pops up that I didn't think about, I find a different source. So that's I think that's what we should be doing our entire lives. And just because we've read it before doesn't mean we can't go back and read it again, restudy it, come at it from a different angle, um, study with someone else, listen to someone else. It's just uh, awesome that we have so many resources to really further our study the rest of our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great point. And if you are interested in any of the resources that we've been using, one of them has been Growth of the Seed, which is a commentary written by Nathan Ward. Then we have Alter's Bible translation has been his translation of the Old Testament has been a great resource. Alastair Roberts is a gentleman who works with what's that group that he's with, Alan? Do you remember the name of it? He is on YouTube. If you just search Alastair Roberts, you can find his videos on YouTube. He's a British man, I do believe. He's got a cool accent. He's very easy to listen to. He does a great job of really jumping into the text and dissecting it. He gives you a number of alternate viewpoints. He will say that this person thinks this person thinks that. I think this, and it just, he gives you options. He gives you a number of different ways to understand the text, and allows you then to make your own conclusion, to understand the text as best you can. The more information that we can have before us, the greater chance we have of gaining a greater grasp on this text. And Alan just posted Alastair Roberts' podcast website link to the comment section in case anybody's interested in checking him out. And he has actually introduced a number of books that he recommends for helping to read the New Testament. He mentions a number of different men who he has learned a lot from in these podcasts, and they're also YouTube videos. And I might get on there and link those if Alan hasn't done it whenever he's giving us some information here in just a moment. I'll see if I can find that on YouTube. But with all that being said, let's do what we do. Get into the text. I'm going to throw the text up on the screen for us here. We are in Genesis chapter 49. This is the text, which is the blessings of, and I want to stress that, the blessings of Jacob towards his sons. He's going to stress that at the very end of this chapter. What we're going to do is work through it bit by bit. We will give attention to Reuben, then give attention to Simeon, Levi, give attention to Judah, a good bit of attention to Judah, and then we'll kind of lump Zebulun through Naphtali together. There's not a ton there as far as text goes. There's also just not a lot of detail, and especially not a lot of detail that we can really draw a lot of really firm understandings from. It's very, very vague at times. Then, of course, we'll spend time on Joseph and Benjamin, and then get into chapter 50 here in just a few minutes. So with that being said, again, Genesis 49, beginning in verse 1, the text tells us that Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather around, and I will tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. Come together and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel." I want to note just a couple of things before we get into Reuben. Number one, what we have here with Jacob is something that we see at different times throughout the Bible. We see people who are about to pass away, they're about to die, giving final words. We see it with Noah's sons in Genesis 9, blessing his sons and speaking of their futures. We see it in Deuteronomy 33 with Moses and the people preparing to enter into Canaan. We see it in David's life as well. As they're getting ready to die and pass away, they have important words they want to share with those whom they're leaving behind. I also want to note here that Jacob is breaking the pattern of blessing his sons from what we've seen with his father Isaac. It seems his father Isaac was going to give a blessing kind of behind closed doors without it being seen by the public. But here, Jacob is saying, I want everybody to come, gather around, listen to what I have to say. There is no secrecy. He wants to be honest and upfront with what he's going to share with everyone. The blessing that Reuben is going to hear, he's going to hear his own blessing. He's going to hear the blessing of all of his brothers as well. And then lastly, there is this shift and this bouncing back and forth almost from Jacob to the name Israel. Remember that names mean something. We're going to see that here within these sons, that their names that we're giving to them, they're going to be playing into their futures in a sense. And then also here with Jacob, he is seen not only as Jacob the man, the son of Isaac, but he's also seen here as Israel, which is the head of a people, the head of a nation. So here he, being the head of the Israelite people, he's going to speak then to his sons. So Jacob speaking to his sons, but what we also have is Israel speaking to its tribes and telling of what is coming in the future. The first one, of course, being Reuben in verse number 3 and 4. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, and the first fruits of my virility, excelling in prominence, excelling in power. But, and I'm throwing in that but, turbulent as water, you will not excel, because you got into your father's bed and you defiled it. He, Jacob says, got into my bed. A quick reversal, it seems here, Alan. This very first blessing that is given starts off really good, doesn't end in the same way, however.
We remember when this happened back in chapter 36, I believe. It was just a quick little blurb, one little verse about Reuben going into Bilhah and Jacob hearing about it, but he never says anything. Well,
close, 35.
So he finally says something. Clearly, he hasn't forgotten about that. And it would seem that just from what we've talked about with Reuben, his other personality or his other characteristics, his status as firstborn, even if Jacob had never said anything, he's kind of lost that leadership role anyway. So I don't know if that's because of the way he was treated by Jacob or the way his brothers just looked elsewhere. We don't know exactly how that happened, but this at least kind of wraps up Reuben's story here. And the key here is why he's not the first. He does not receive the firstborn blessing, and why Joseph and his two sons, or Ephraim and Manasseh, received that instead. This is just telling you why.
Right, and it is this again is not the first time that we've seen a son and his bad behavior come back to bite him in the way that his father deals with him. We see this as well with Ham and the sin that he committed against his father in Genesis chapter 9. Like you mentioned, this is the firstborn status being taken away from him. And the thought then would be, well, if it's taken away from Reuben, then it would be passed on to either Simeon or Levi, because they would be the next in line. And yet what we see as we continue to read through these blessings is what we see in verse number 5, that Simeon and Levi, here they are put together as a pair. The text says that Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their knives are vicious weapons. May I never enter their council. May I never join their assembly. For in their anger they kill men, and on a whim they hamstring oxen. Their anger is cursed, for it is strong, and their fury, for it is cruel. I will disperse them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. Of course, Alan, our audience might pick up that this seems pretty certain this is hearkening back to Genesis chapter 34 and what took place in that text where Simeon and Levi went up against the Shechemites, I believe it was, and because of the
they're avenging Dinah.
Yeah, I was going to say Tamar. Tamar's different woman, avenging Dinah and the perceived sin that was committed against her. This one, out of all the judgments, to me is, I don't want to say the coolest, but it's almost the coolest. Just the way Jacob speaks of these two brothers. I just see these mighty, valiant warriors, and yet it's not exactly a heaping of praise, because there is a sense here in which there is a curse almost that is given to them in this section. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's definitely not a positive. It's not necessarily a curse. I mean, these are still blessings.
True.
There's definitely, and we already said, this will happen to you in the days to come. There's a prophetic aspect of all of these, but these are also, that's what's tricky with each one. There's some parts that are prophecy of the tribe as a whole and their future. There's some parts that obviously have to do with the individual, Simeon, Levi, Reuben, and their actions and the results of their actions. This one is kind of both. These are vicious brothers, but we'll see that Simeon and Levi, this prophecy does come to play later on. It mentions, I will disperse them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. Well, what happens later on to these two tribes? Simeon actually doesn't really get a portion of their own in the promised land when they take it over. They end up kind of assimilating with Judah. They're almost like tag-alongs with the larger tribe of Judah, to the point where eventually they just kind of fall off the map. They just almost cease to exist as their own entity, their own tribe. So they're scattered. Well, Levi has a different kind of scattering. We know later on that Levi will not have their own land, but because of their status as the priests of Israel, they will have certain cities throughout Israel. So they will be scattered, but in a different sense. Kind of interesting that the Levites gained that favored status to become the priests through their sword. If you we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, but in Exodus chapter 32, the episode of the golden calf, when all of the people were worshiping this golden calf while Moses was on the mountain. Well, Moses comes down, he throws the two tablets, all that happens. Well, he calls the people that are for God and with Moses to him. Well, who is that? That's the Levites. And the Levites go around and exact the vengeance against the people. They kill many of the people with the sword. So we'll see that this is so interesting, that this prophecy here, or this blessing, there are some personality quirks that apply to Simeon and Levi, but also will apply later on to the tribe as a whole throughout their history.
And it is interesting you talk about these being really prophetic utterances, which they are. What makes that maybe a little, I don't know if to say humorous, but makes it funny is the fact that this is a man who at this point can't see. Physically, his sight is extremely diminished, and yet spiritually and in an insightful way, of course, with, I believe, that being divine influences here, he's able to see exactly who these men are and who their descendants are going to be. Here, Reuben is going to face difficulty because of his past sins are going to come back against his own people. We're going to see Simeon and Levi, who they were as people, is going to be taken into account as they move forward. What I take away, what you mentioned, Levi, they're not going to have their own lands. There's going to be scattered about in different places, fulfilling the priestly roles. And then for Simeon, there's a lot of tie-in here with Deuteronomy 33. I don't remember if you mentioned that or not. I was looking for the YouTube channel for Alistair Roberts. But Deuteronomy 33, where Moses gives a blessing to the tribes of Israel, Simeon's not mentioned at all. He is almost seen as if it doesn't even exist. So we see this here. And note too that they're put together here as brothers, as strong brothers, and together they're strong. Together they can get a lot done. There's almost a sense here as if they're being separated in an effort to control their prowess so that they don't have such a great impact on the people as a whole moving forward. And then Judah, of course, this is one of the most important of the blessings that we find in this chapter because it has such great significance moving forward. A lot of this might be difficult to understand, Alan, and we're going to give some explanation for that. But as far as, again, as significance goes, the impact of any of these brothers, this is the brother. This is the brother that is going to have the most influence moving forward. Judah, verse 8, your brothers will praise you. There's a play on words because Judah means praise. And your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches, he lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. He ties his donkey to a vine, and the colt of his donkey to the choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth are whiter than milk. There's a lot here, Alan. What do you want to share with the audience concerning the significance of this particular blessing to Judah?
It's clear that this one is completely different from the first the first three brothers. This is much more positive throughout, and again, it just makes sense when, if you were just reading this by itself, this wouldn't make much sense. But when you've read the entirety of chapter 35 and on, then all of these, those little blurbs that we've tried to highlight really tie in. Why is chapter 38 and Judah and Tamar there?
That's
well,
great.
That makes sense
Great
when you tie all this in. So I find it interesting in verse 8, your father's sons will bow down to you. Well, remember that was the beginning of the whole problem when Joseph was having these dreams that everyone would bow down to him, and those came to pass. Well, now it's going to be, obviously this is going to be later on when through Judah we have the kingly line. David, Solomon, all the kings of Judah would come through this Judah. So he's described as a lion, obviously a lion being king of the jungle, the preeminent beast of the field. His power and his might are unparalleled. The idea of the scepter and the staff not departing Judah is kind of a little bit of irony when we look back at chapter 38, because what was it that Judah gave to Tamar just as as a promise that he'd pay her for her for what she did? He gave his staff like a scepter. That was his symbol of authority. So Judah, the man, gives that away freely, and we'll see that later on. I think he gets it back and has more appreciation for the role he has as leader of his family. But the scepter, the staff, the rule of the people will not depart from Judah. I think this is pretty clearly a look toward David and the promises that will be given to him, that he will not lack a man on the throne from his household. And that's obviously as a prophecy that looks toward Christ and his rule in the kingdom of God forever. So we're seeing little snippets, little beginnings of even messianic prophecies right here.
Right. And if you look at this blessing, it is the building from, it's really the development of Judah as a character within the narrative. He begins on a very negative note, being the one to sell Joseph into the traders' hands. And yet, as we progress, we see him again, and not in a very good light in chapter 38 in regards to Tamar. But then he steps up, he defends Benjamin. He also in that whole ordeal with Tamar, he is humbled in a sense. He's humbled, and he sees how low he has gone in his character and who he has been as a person. And then we see him again arise. He ends up defending Benjamin and takes a positive leadership role, which that might be something that is being described in verse number 9, where he goes from a young lion to lioness, kind of some development there within that verse. But everything in verse number 10, there's just so much that is uncertain as far as terms go. If you have a study Bible at all, you might have some notes there concerning Shiloh. And yet Shiloh is not talked about anywhere else in Scripture, so we don't really know how to tie that into the text. But I think your comment about this being messianic is spot on. And not only messianic, but the kingly role that this brother is going to play. Remember, David is of the tribe of Judah, and his scepter, you might say, his rule, his authority as a king is never going to depart from Israel again. We can tie this in with what is seen in Ezekiel 21 and verses 26 and 27. I think that has some play here within this text. Though we might not know for certain the proper terms, maybe the best way to translate, I think that without a doubt we see this being the blessing. We think about the blessing that's given to the firstborn normally. It wasn't given to Judah, wasn't given to Simeon, wasn't given to Levi. It comes here to Judah. Judah is the son who is going to receive the blessing. And this isn't just any old blessing. This, I believe, would be the blessing, tracing all the way back to Genesis 12 concerning Abraham, and through his seed, all of the nations of the earth being blessed. That is through Judah here, that he is going to be the conduit through which the Messiah is going to come. And verse 11, then, all these are terms of excess and of extreme blessings. Again, this being tied into Judah, and not just being tied into Judah, but being tied into the messianic promise, I believe here, that somebody would tie a donkey and its colt to the vine, the grapevine, which you would never do that because that's something of great importance. Why would you ever tie an animal to the vine that might harm it? Well, because there's such great excess. Why in the world would you wash your clothes in grape juice? Well, because it's an excess. There's so much of it. Well, how much? That your eyes are going to be darker than the wine, your teeth are whiter than milk. Through Judah is going to come extreme blessings, not just to Israel again, but through him, all of the world is going to be blessed. Al, anything else on Judah before we move on?
That's all I had.
All right. Let's read this section now of these brothers, Zebulun through Naphtali, and if Alan has anything he wants to hit on a couple of those, we'll do that. And a little tip again, a lot of this is very vague. There's not much that we can look to as really strong fulfillment in Scripture. I think we can see some of that with Simeon and Levi. Definitely see some of that with Judah. Not as much here with Zebulun through Naphtali. And note too that this is not in order of birth. There's a differing of order here, and some have different ideas as to why that is the case. But with Zebulun, the text says Zebulun will live by the seashore and will be a harbor for ships, and his territory will be next to Sidon. Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between the saddlebags. He saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he leaned his shoulder to bear a load and became a forced laborer. Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the road, a viper beside the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backwards. Verse 18, I wait for your salvation, Lord. Gad will be attacked by raiders, but he will attack their heels. Asher's food will be rich, and he will produce royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Alan, anything of significance you want to give to these particular brothers?
You mentioned earlier a lot of these. This chapter is so difficult because these are not all just necessarily prophecies. Some of these are, merely blessings, or they might a lot of them have something to do with just their name and kind of plays on words with their name. Gad in verse 19 is a good example. The word Gad, I think, means like troop or raider.
Mm-hmm.
And it says Gad will be attacked. You might say raided by raiders, but he will raid their heels. So the raider will be raided by raiders, but he will raid their heels. You kind of see the wordplay if you put it that way. So Dan is another. His name means judge. So that's a lot of what's happening. So it's a little tough to put all of this, and most of these you can't go and find the fulfillment of these prophecies anywhere in Scripture. You might have some glimpses, some connections just with events that happened maybe within the territory, or like a judge that came from like Samson comes from the tribe of Dan. Mm-hmm. So you might make some connections there. Right. But if they were more important, I think we would have more clear references to them later on, like we do with Judah. So we can argue back and forth about what they mean, but it's not too terribly important, I don't think.
Correct. Yeah. Again, looking at Simeon Levi, we can find some maybe rock solid fulfillments of these blessings. With these, maybe not so much. You think about Zebulun, maybe a better translation would be Zebulun will live toward the seashore, towards the water. It's in the upper area of Galilee, towards the Mediterranean Sea. And also just think about Zebulun would be a very energetic and prosperous tribe. And that contrasts with Issachar, which is seen to be kind of lazy and submissive. There's really, if you look at the tribes within the book of Judges, Issachar, nada. There just is not much mentioning of the people of Issachar participating much in that. Dan, as you mentioned, name place, Samson, there's some idolatry that's mentioned and that's associated with Dan. Gad, that was a great point. I like what Nathan Ward says in his commentary from the ESV. It is super repetitive. Dan will be raided by raiders, and he will raid the raiders' heels. If you read that verse and don't know what it's talking about, then I don't have much for you. Asher means fortune, which there's tremendous blessings in that verse. Naphtali, maybe there's some tie-ins there with Judges 4 and 5. We just can't know with great certainty, but those are some options. Maybe you do some digging and come to better understanding in your own further study. Let's look at verse 22, which now gets to the blessing that is given to Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful vine beside a spring. Its branches climb over the wall. The archers attacked him, shot at him, and were hostile toward him. Yet his bow remained steady, and his strong arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the name of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, by the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of the heavens above, blessings of the deep that lies below, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of your father excel the blessings of my ancestors, and the bounty of the ancient hills. May they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince of his brothers. I think a lot of this, Alan, will be familiar to our audience, just kind of the way this blessing flows. We can see how this would play into maybe what has happened in Joseph's life previously. And really, there's two different ways to look at this particular blessing. There are some who take it, a lot of it looking back, and there are some who take everything looking forward. So maybe just share a few of those examples if you saw that in Nathan's commentary on this particular section.
Yeah, I tend to take this a little more individualistically. if you remember back in chapter 48, the previous chapter, Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, have already received the blessing. They've received their family blessing. So this one, it wouldn't make sense to bless Joseph, which in turn is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh again as a tribe, as a whole. So that's why I kind of view this more as less prophecy and less, future blessing, and more just kind of a individual personal blessing, which seems to flow because it talks about, these archers and all these attackers that attack Joseph. Well, clearly, I think that's discussing his treatment by his brothers.
Right, I agree with that.
His bow remains steady, so Joseph remains faithful. He does not stray from doing what's right, and he is blessed by. I mean, it names God in 4 or 5 different ways. He receives all these blessings. I think verse 26 is interesting. The blessings of your father excel the blessings of my ancestors. Well, where do we last see that word excel? It was with Reuben in a negative sense. You will not excel. I think it says in verse 4, turbulent as water, you will not excel. Well, who is going to excel in Reuben's place as firstborn? Well, it's Joseph, whose 2 sons essentially receive the firstborn blessing. So I think that's kind of a play on words there as well. But yeah, I don't see much in the way of future blessing for the tribe of Joseph, as much as I see just individual blessing for Joseph himself, the man.
Right, because you think about it, the blessing, as you mentioned, that would have been given to him has already been given to his sons. And his sons are going to receive that future blessing. And Ephraim especially is going to take a very prominent place within the land of Israel. And here, this is Joseph, or maybe Jacob, just acknowledging what he's been through, and acknowledging not just what he's been through, but the fact that God has been with him all along the way, and that God has been the one that has sustained him and blessed him to get them to this place. And then lastly, we have Benjamin, beginning in verse number 27, where Benjamin is a wolf. Ooh, he tears his prey. In the morning, he devours the prey, and in the evening, he divides the plunder. Verse 28, these are the tribes of Israel, 12 in all, and this is what their father said to them. He blessed them, and he blessed each one with a suitable blessing. What about verse 27 and 28, Alan?
Kind of a stark contrast, because Benjamin's the youngest. He's been almost babied his entire life. Right. Jacob doesn't want him to go down to Egypt because he might get taken captive or something. You just get the sense that Benjamin's this hopeless little boy, and now it's he's this wolf. He tears his prey. He's not hopeless at all. So kind of just an interesting contrast there. I don't know if. I know later on in the book of Judges, Benjamin, toward the end of Judges, Benjamin kind of has, the tribe of Benjamin has a little bit of trouble, to the point that they're almost annihilated by their brothers. So, right. So I think there's definitely some foreshadowing with all of this as well. It's good to note too that the first king of Israel, Saul, is from the tribe of Benjamin. So kind of interesting there, but which kind of makes sense. You definitely see of the tribes that make it past into the united and divided kingdom in any sense. You have Judah, obviously, but really the rest of the tribes are kind of combined into Israel. You don't really see the Reubenite or the Danite as quite as much in that day and age, but you still see Benjamin usually uniting with Judah and staying faithful to the Judahite king. So just kind of interesting history with that tribe throughout the rest of the Bible.
And besides, let's see here, besides King Saul, probably the second most, maybe the first most famous Benjaminite would be that of the Apostle Paul. Mm-hmm. Verse 28, what I want to emphasize here is simply what is emphasized. what is emphasized is that second verse. He blessed them, and he blessed each one of them with a suitable blessing. Though we might look at these and see these maybe in the sense of a couple of them, at least in the sense of a cursing, it's not a cursing, it's just pronouncements. It is a foretelling of what awaits for many of these men and their descendants further down the line. And again, this was not just the hope, this was not given on a hope and a whim by Jacob. I do believe there is some, if we can call it divine inspiration here in a sense. This is certainly prophecy where he is giving insight into the future in a divine sense, I do believe. Verse 29 says that then Jacob commanded them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. The cave is in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in the land of Canaan. This is the field Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite as burial property. Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried there. Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried there, and I buried Leah there. The field and the cave in it were purchased from the Hittites. And when Jacob had finished giving charges to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, took his last breath, and was gathered to his people. The commands here, or the final wishes, we might call them, Alan, of Jacob are quite clear. Don't leave me here. When I pass, I want to go be buried with my fathers. What do you think about the emphasis here that he gives on detailing exactly how they obtained this land, number one, who they obtained it from, where it's from, and the fact that all of my forefathers there? What's the significance here in this text, in Jacob sharing this with his sons, and that really giving strong emphasis to his wishes?
I think there's definitely an understanding of the promises that were first given to Abraham, then Jacob's father Isaac, then to Jacob himself. Make a great nation. I think that's happened at this point. They've become a great nation, but the land promise it has not quite been fulfilled yet. They've been in the land, but that land promise is under threat in a sense because they're not there. They're not in possession of it at the time. They still have, but this Jacob is remembering. He knows that they have a portion. They have a property there that is theirs. It gives it in great detail right here. The cave, Machpelah, where it's at, who he bought it from. All of that is repeated again in this section. I think the emphasis on this going back and remembering the land of Canaan is so important because of what's about to happen over the next couple hundred years. They're not going to be there for a long time. It would be easy to just settle in, assimilate with the Egyptians and completely lose their national identity because of where they're at. But they can't do that. They've taken steps to avoid that by where they settle in the land of Goshen, and not amongst the Egyptians. They're separated from them, but there's still that possibility. And he's just trying to remind them, hey, this is important. You got to go back at some point. I'm going back there. Make sure I go back there after I die. Don't leave me in this land. And we'll see Joseph does the same thing. He gives those similar instructions to take his bones back to Canaan. But it just shows their faith, knowing that God's promises he's promised something. It hasn't come about yet, but their faith is that those promises will come about at some point in the future.
Absolutely. I think the emphasis here, and if I remember right, there's 1, 2, let's see here. Let's see if I'll find it real fast. 2, 3. I think 3 times where it's emphasized specifically that this was purchased. So there was a transaction. And if we go back into the story of Abraham, let's see here. We are find this portion, I'll say it's 25. No, not 25. 24. It's 24. So somewhere along the way, whenever we get to, or in the process of Abraham having this transaction with Ephron the Hittite, there was this effort by the Hittites just to give it to him. Here, you can have this. But Abraham said, no, I don't want to just take it. I want to buy it. I want this to be a legal transaction to where everybody could see this was done in an honorable way. And it seems then that this legal transaction for Abraham to purchase this land is now leading to legal language here in Genesis 49 and coming up in Genesis 50. Is what we see here: bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. This is the field Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite. So 4 times, I should say. There's twice here and 3 times here and one other time in 50. But this legal language shows that this land is legally bound to the family of Abraham, which is going to come into play, I believe, in chapter 50, in verse 24, whenever Joseph says, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What you said, Alan, spot on. There is strong emphasis here for Jacob towards his sons, for them to recognize that this is your land. This is where you belong. Not only is this where you belong, this is where I belong. That's why I want to be buried there. Joseph is going to say, I want to be buried there. This is your place. So upon then Joseph dying at the end of chapter 49, chapter 50 verse 1 says that Joseph, leaning over his father's face, wept and kissed him. He commanded his servants who were physicians to embalm his father. So they embalmed Israel. They took 40 days to complete this, for embalming takes that long, and the Egyptians mourned for 70 days. And when the days of mourning were over, Joseph said to Pharaoh's household, if I found favor with you, please tell Pharaoh that my father made me take an oath, saying, I'm about to die. You must bury me there in the tomb that I made for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go and bury my father, then I will return. So Pharaoh said, go and bury your father in keeping with your oath. Then Joseph went to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went with him, along with all Joseph's family, his brothers, and his father's family. Only their descendants, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. Horses and chariots went up with him. It was a very impressive procession. And when they reached the threshing floor of Atad, which is across the Jordan, they lamented and wept loudly. And Joseph mourned 7 days for his father. And when the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians. Therefore, the place is named Abel Mizraim. It is across the Jordan. So Jacob's sons did for him what he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave at Machpelah in the field near Mamre, which Abraham had purchased as burial property from Ephron the Hittite. So it's 5 times actually. After Joseph buried his father, he returned to Egypt, and his brothers and all who had gone with him to bury his father. Alan, what stands out to me here is that this was not just a mourning on behalf of Joseph and his family, but as we've noted on a number of occasions, we see mourning on behalf of the Egyptians as well. We see Pharaoh being very, very easily persuaded to allow Joseph to leave Egypt, to take nearly his entire family, and to go fulfill this oath that he had made to his father. What do you make of Pharaoh's attitude and the Egyptians' attitude towards Joseph's now passed father?
You can't help but see the parallels with this chapter and about 12 chapters later in the book of Exodus. We have, it's interesting, we kind of see the path that this mourning party takes. If you look at a map of this area, there's a straight path from Egypt to Israel. It's through like the land of the Philistines. There's an easier way to get there. Well, what did they do? They actually go through the wilderness and they come to what's called across the Jordan. Well, that would be the eastern side of the Jordan, modern day Jordan now. But whenever across the Jordan, it's the other side of the Jordan River from Israel. So if you're looking at your map, they're actually coming around and coming into Israel from across the river, across the Jordan River, which is the exact same path that Moses and that generation will take as they exit and wander through the wilderness, and then Moses dies on Mount Nebo, and they cross into to Israel, cross into Canaan, where Jericho is. This is the exact same path that they take, which is definitely unnecessary on the part of Joseph. So you can't help but see some parallels with that path. And also notice what's happening with the Egyptians. In this chapter, the Egyptians are completely fine. They are a part of this journey too. It mentions all of the Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his household, the elders of the land of Egypt. They're going along with him. This is not an exodus in the dead of night like it will be in 12 chapters. This is a joint journey by the Israelites and the Egyptians. I think it even says in verse 5, Joseph asks, now let me go and bury my father. Well, what were Moses and Aaron asking Pharaoh in the book of Exodus? Let us go.
Let us go.
And that Pharaoh always said no. What does this Pharaoh say? Go and bury your father. He's fine with it. So just I think that's the point. You're seeing in an ideal world, this was how the children of Israel were supposed to leave Egypt.
Yep.
But for the hardness of that Pharaoh's heart in the book of Exodus, that required a great redemption in the crossing of the Red Sea by God. Well, Egypt could have been a part of this journey and allowed them to go, gone with them, escorted them. This is what happens. They escorted the Israelites, Joseph and his family, all the way to the borders of Canaan, and wept for Jacob. This was a friendly procession, whereas it definitely will not be in the next book.
That's great. Sorry, I'm right. What you're writing, I'm writing in my Bible right now. So for those who think that we have it all figured out once we get on here, no, I am certainly learning a lot and taking a lot of the connections that Alan shares with us for myself. So you are not, for our audience, you are not only learning, but I am learning right along beside you with that great insight. Thank you, Alan. That's fantastic. Continuing through the text, then we notice that now that Joseph is gone, the brothers, their attitude now that Jacob is gone, the brothers' attitude towards Joseph shifts somewhat. It is as if they feel as though their father being alive provides them a sense of safety from Joseph, that Joseph would not take out vengeance for their evil against him while their father lives. But now in verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, Joseph is holding a grudge against us. He will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. So they sent this message to Joseph. They didn't go themselves. No, they sent a message to Joseph. Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph, please forgive your brother's transgressions and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him, and his brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Alan, there is maybe the unanswerable question here about all this is, are they telling the truth? Verse 17, verses 16, 17, 18, they say that this was a claim made by Jacob. We don't have that in the text. And maybe in reality that doesn't have that much importance here. But it's just interesting maybe to have some insight into their mindset, whether they truly feel that Joseph would do right by them, whether they feel they need to make this up possibly in order to preserve themselves.
I think this does give us insight into their mindset. Yes, we've seen from their actions in all of the testing that Joseph gave them that, I mean, I think they had remorse for what they've done, and they have changed in certain ways. They were not willing to, forget about their brother Simeon and sell him off, or same with Benjamin. They were not willing to just give him up and save their own skin. So they have grown, but right here, just the fact that they've seen for about 17 years now, they've seen Joseph's character, and they've seen Joseph take care of them and say these things. I mean, weep and welcome them and kiss them and talk with them. They've been with him for these 17 years since all that, and yet they still have to do this. They still have to take these steps. They still it's like they can't believe that Joseph could do this, because there's
no way he just lets get away with this. Basically,
yeah, they would never be able to do this. They see, like, okay, we have really, I mean, we've caused him suffering. Like, we really sinned against this guy. If it were me, I would never be able to forgive him. So even though Joseph's done all these things and said all these things to alleviate these fears, when Jacob's gone, they still have this worry right here. So it's sad that they've had to hold on to these fears this whole time. I mean, this isn't just something like, oh, wait a minute, Jacob's dead, I wonder what Joseph's. I mean, I'm sure they were dreading this up to this point. And I mean, Joseph, to his credit, I mean, I think that's why he weeps. He sees that despite everything he's done, they still can't trust him. I mean, Joseph's done everything he can. This is not anything Joseph didn't do, but he's just upset at this situation that has caused. But whatever he says at this point, I think they finally have kind of they finally have unity again after this. Even up to this point, there's not been this unity because they clearly have misgivings about Joseph to a certain extent. So, and that upsets Joseph when he realizes that. But I love this ending for Genesis, because verse 19, Joseph said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Well, where did our story start in Genesis and in the garden?
In the place of God. Oh man.
It was with Eve and Adam, wanting to be in the place of God. That's why they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They wanted to be like God. What were the people in Babel doing? They wanted to be in the place of God. And now we see someone doing the opposite, realizing that vengeance is something that is God's. Vengeance is mine, I shall repay, says the Lord. We'll see that later in Scripture. So Joseph understands his role, even though, I mean, he's the second most powerful man in the world at this point. He is still not in the place of God, and he has about as close of an understanding of the nature of God as anyone throughout the first 50 chapters of the Bible.
See, Alan, that type of insight right there is why you get paid the big bucks on this show. That is a fantastic tie in the place of God. Not only in a literal sense, it begins in the place of God, which is Eden, but it is also, as you mentioned, Adam and Eve trying to elevate themselves to the place of God, even though they were already, in a sense, in the place of God, being made as image bearers of his. We certainly do see a contrasting mindset between Adam and Eve and Joseph here, who is content to humble himself to this place and not take more than has been given to him. Well, no, just one thing. If you're ever going to put together a begging of your life towards someone who you think is a godly person, number one, bring your dead father into it. Number two, acknowledge your sin. Number three, acknowledge the hurt that it caused. Number four, bring God into it as well. If you really want to try to butter somebody up to where they might forgive you something wrong that you've done, really take into consideration the way they do this for Joseph. It wasn't their plan that made this work. It was Joseph's heart. But be that just take that as that little piece of advice here is a good way to really put forth in reality, whether this was true or not, whether this plea of Jacob on behalf of the sons was true, this is a good apology. This is the way that you apologize for something that you done, whether the motivation was simply to try to save their own skin, or whether there was a true remorse that they had not exactly expressed up to this point. This is a solid apology. And we might add into verse 18, them bowing down before him. They've already done that before in the story. Here is just another fulfillment of what Joseph said back in chapter 37 and verse 7.
Verse 20 is pretty important there. I can't help but look forward with that verse. You planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Mm-hmm. That verse is going to get played out several times throughout the Bible. We'll see it in Exodus. Pharaoh planning evil against, the Egyptians, planning evil against the Israelites, making them slaves. Mm-hmm. Well, God uses that to bring about the result, which is the survival of his people and the Exodus, the redemption. And then, of course, that points all the way to the cross. I mean, what more evil could be done than the killing of an innocent person? You planned evil against the Christ, this innocent Son of God, yet God planned it for good to bring out what result? The survival of his people, and that is the church, his church. So just the beginnings of several redemption stories, and what's the common thread? God planned it. God is in control of this entire narrative we've seen so far. He'll be in control over the next in the next book of Exodus. Mm-hmm. He'll be in control when the Israelites or when the nations are in Babylon and a threat of being completely annihilated and destroyed. Yet he delivers them and brings them back to the land, and Ezra and Nehemiah and those books. And then of course, Jesus' sacrifice and the cross is the ultimate example of that planning coming to fruition, and God helping his people survive.
Now, I believe Joseph recognized that they were now participating in a portion of that mm-hmm. God was fulfilling this plan through them and their family. Verse 22 says that Joseph and his father's family remained in Egypt, and Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's sons to the third generation. The sons of Manasseh's sons, Machir, were recognized by Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. So here's his version of what Jacob did earlier. But notice this, God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I believe that's a tie-in. Always see this type of legal type of language, that God's made this promise. It is a binding promise. He's going to fulfill this promise. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. The same desire that Jacob had, Joseph has here. And then Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. And that, Alan, concludes our walk through the history that is contained within Genesis. What do you have to add before we close out this afternoon?
We were able to tie back to the garden in the fall, but I think this ties in really good as well. I mean, we finish. It's fairly happy. The brothers they're reconciled again. Everything's going pretty well. Joseph lives to 100 a rich age, but what's the last verse? Joseph died, mm-hmm. and that's not how the book started. No. But pretty quickly, chapter 3, the fall of man, the entrance of death into this world. And what did we see throughout the genealogies and with every single person except for Enoch, really, at this point, is death, and death. So it's a positive. I mean, they're in a good place at the end of this book, but also as a whole, there's still death. And you can't help but see this continue. I mean, there's going to be highs and lows and, good things that happen throughout the Bible, but it's until the death of Christ that we finally see the end of death foretold, and the end of death being possible because of that.
And that's what this book is doing. It's continuing on the story. The story in Genesis begins with life, and then there is a fall from life because of sin. And what this story is doing from Genesis on is leading us back to life. And that life is going to come through the man Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross, his resurrection, and his ascension back to the right hand of God, where he rules even now, continuing to give life. Well, if you just told somebody Genesis begins with life, death quickly is introduced, and yet the end of the story is going to be life again. Somebody says, well, how do we get there? How do we get back to life? Well, Genesis has just told us part of that story. That's how we're going to get to the life, which is Jesus the Christ. Alan, thank you so much for your participation in this section of this portion of our study going through Genesis. I'm excited about continuing on this study throughout the Exodus story. We'll have more details next week about how we're going to go about that. But I hope that you have, those of our audience that have been with us this whole time, I hope that you've benefited greatly from our study. Again, I know I have. And if none of you learned anything, then I can at least say it's been beneficial, because I've certainly learned something. But I know there's been a lot of things that Alan has shared with you all that has helped you in your understanding. And if you have an opportunity, reach out to Alan, tell him thank you for a lot of the work that he's done over the past few weeks and going through this study here in Genesis. As we said, we're going to continue walking through his story, walking through the history of the Bible in Exodus this upcoming Tuesday at 3 p.m., I do believe. But make sure you check each week about that, because my wife is going back to work a little bit now, and she works sometimes in the morning. So depending on when she gets off work is when we're going to have this study. So just pay attention.
Mine's
to the time
pregnant,
on
so
that. You're stuck at home. You're still under house arrest. You're playing the good part of Paul right now.
But mine's pregnant, so we might miss a class here and there.
That's true. Yeah, I'm planning on being out of town in the middle part of July, so we are probably going to be doing some pre-recordings and posting those at our normal times, just to make sure that this continues to go on. But again, we'll keep you posted on all of those developments. Continue to pray for Alan again and Melanie as baby Lincoln is quickly making his approach. Continue to be prayerful for our church family, for our shepherds as they continue to lead us in a safe way throughout this difficult time, and pray for us as we continue to do this study, that God bless us with wisdom and ability to serve you in the best way possible. Thank you all so much for your participation and your being with us. Thank you for your kind words. May God bless you. Have a great rest of your Friday. And if you need someplace to worship on Sunday, we invite you, if you can be with us in person, 384 Pleasant Plains Road is the address. We'll be meeting at 10 for an hour of worship. And I'm going to be preaching this upcoming Sunday on the idea of being fishers of men. I've been doing a lot of fishing during this crisis, kind of something that I picked up that I wasn't doing much before. There's been a lot of lessons I've learned about fishing, some that have spiritual applications. I want to share those with you. But if you can't join us in person, you're always welcome to join us online. And on the Pleasant Plains Facebook page, we'll be live streaming that service for the benefit of those who can't be with us. Again, thank you all so much. God bless you. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.